good afternoon. This is a UK column special, and we're here today to have a discussion regarding a whole range of topics surrounding the anti-Semitism crisis, surrounding Jewish identity and culture, and we're very lucky to have as our guest Gilad Atzmon. Gilad is a jazz saxophonist of renown and an author, and one of the most gallant voices talking about Jewish identity politics. We're also joined by a UK column founder, presenter, and researcher on many aspects of the abuse of power, Brian Gerrish, former Royal Navy officer and long-time journalist, campaigner, and thorn in the side of the establishment. And also by Alex Thompson, Alex, former GCHQ officer, linguist, translator, and UK column contributor. I'd like to throw things over to Brian Gerrish to start. This is an issue that he's noted, the sort of power of the Conservative Friends of Israel and the Labour Friends of Israel. So I'd like to hand over to Brian just to outline his thoughts on that.
David, thank you very much for that. And Gilad, thank you for agreeing to come and have a chat with us. Just set the scene a little bit. I had a professional career in the Navy for whatever it was, 21 years. And after that, worked in business, mainly construction industry orientated, I suppose. And it wasn't until the issue of the European Union came up that I started to get involved in politics. And in the early days, that was with UKIP or people associated with UKIP. I've moved away from that style of campaigning now. I believe it's better to come in independent of a political party. But I have to go back sort of 15 years. I started to get interested in what was happening with the European Union. And I started to learn about politics. I did actually at one stage stand as a parliamentary candidate, which was a lot of hard work, but also a lot of fun. And I learned a lot here in Plymouth. So I've come to understand quite a bit about politics. But it was only been in recent years that I discovered the influence that was coming into our political system from Israel. And when you start to focus on that power, of course, Conservative Friends of Israel and Labour Friends of Israel become very important. And if people go and have a look at the websites for those two organisations, they will see that there are long lists of MPs, both Tories and Labour, who are working to help promote the interests of the Conservative Friends, and those interests are overwhelmingly to support Israel. And it's very clear that a significant amount of money is made available to help campaigning through those organisations. So when I discovered this, I became, I think curious is the right word, as to how Israel was able to exert quite so much power into the heart of Britain's political scene without, I think, many of the general public being aware. And David Cameron was one of the people who was very quick in his early days as Prime Minister to stand up and say that his loyalty to Israel was unshakable. And I thought this was a very interesting comment, because I'm going to use the expression deliberately, no man can have two masters. And this meant that his loyalty to the United Kingdom seemed to come into question, which had priority, Israel or the United Kingdom. So I started to ask some questions. I've started to look at the amounts of money changing hands, and we've got some very big figures being talked about, millions of pounds. It's clear Israel has a very strong lobbying power at the heart of the British government. I feel slightly uncomfortable about this. I wonder if I can ask what your opinion is, and really what you would say about the way that those two organisations go about their business. I'm happy to to hear that the work they're doing is worthwhile. I'm also happy to hear any other comments you might have. But what do you think of Israel's lobbying ability within the United Kingdom?
Yeah, I think that it is disaster. It is cancerous. And in practical terms, I think that it would be right to say that Britain by now is an occupied territory. And I think that the best way to look at it is to examine what is happening in the Labour Party. We can easily see that not adhering to Israeli interest or Israeli politics, or what some people may call Zionist interest, would cost you your political career. And it extends beyond just politicians. We can see that the Labour Party is now taking instructions from Zionist bodies in Britain and expelling and suspending its best members. And I'm not talking just about Ken Livingstone. I'm talking about ordinary members. We don't even know how many. Some people say that we are talking about hundreds. Other people say that we are talking about thousands. We can see that the Labour Party is actually digging into their members' social media accounts in order to find what they called anti-Semitic materials. This is Big Brother approach. I think that part of it is that it has something to do with the left mind and the left structure and left ideology, as Orwell predicted already in 48 when he wrote 84. But a lot of it, the catalyst here is definitely the Israeli lobby. Now, there is one thing that I want to mention that is not mentioned at all in the British media, not by commentators, not by political analysts. And this is something that I learned from Israeli press, from Israeli media, because I monitor Israeli press. I'm a Hebrew speaker. Israelis do understand that in case we break away from Europe, Brexit goes ahead, Israel becomes the gateway access for Britain to the world. Why Israel? Because Israel is probably the only state in the world that is in very good relationship with both America and Russia, America and China, and certainly India. If we are not in a bond with the EU, or this bond is changing, Israelis or Israeli politicians understand that Israel is crucial. Now, if this can be jeopardized by Corbyn make it into a prime minister of the United Kingdom, because he could jeopardize such a development. So we can. I believe that the entire anti-Semitic campaign against the Labour Party and against Corbyn is there to prevent Corbyn from becoming prime minister, so he cannot interfere with our relationship with Israel. Nobody dares writing about it. It's quite obvious, because writing about it, mentioning it, would cost you your career in the BBC, in the Guardian, in university, and so on and so on. And this is exactly the true meaning of being an occupied territory.
To help me understand this, are we talking about the Israeli power purely being political? Is the lobbying power only coming through to people who are in the political system? Clearly, we can see that the conservative friends of Israel, Labour friends of Israel, are paying for people to go to Israel and be educated about the country and relations with Palestine, etc. But is the power purely political, or is this? I loosely call it power from Israel. Is that exerted on anybody who's a member of the Jewish community in Britain?
To start with, I don't like to talk about the Jewish community as a whole. I didn't make a study of Jewish community. What I do, I actually study the culture, the ideology, the metaphysics. Now, my study suggests that the notion of Jewish political power or Zionist politics is not something that is restricted to politics or to culture or to financial forces. It's an amalgam of many things that are well connected. And why they are well connected? Because we are living now in a world that is governed by identity politics. And we are familiar with the idea that people are identified as women, as Muslim, as Jews, as gays, as transsexual. The thing is that Jewish lobbies and Jewish identitarian politics is doing way better than anyone else because of the obvious reasons the Jews have been doing it for 2,000 years. So when it comes to feminist gays, we are talking about something that started in the 20th century. When it comes to black identitarian bodies, it's in Britain, it's something that started after World War II due to immigration and so on and so on. When it comes to Jews, we're really talking about 2,000 years, 2,200 years, in which Jews are identifying politically, culturally, religiously the other. And they've managed to develop through the religion, through the folklore, a lot of instruments that make them united when they have to be united. It makes their elite very pushy, and they believe that it has to be pushy. And it also makes them divided when they have to be divided. So they, for instance, can be divided about Palestine. They can be divided about neoconservative wars. They can be divided about Brexit if this is good for the Jews. And it's not conspiratorial because thanks to the culture, it happens naturally.
I'd like to pick up on one of the points that you were discussing there, and it's this, the attack on the anti-Semitism attack on the Labour Party. And I've been looking at this, and I found it to be a very strange thing. And the inability of the Labour Party to defend itself against this charge is likewise a very strange thing. So I'll just lay out quickly my analysis of this and ask Gilad to kind of comment on it. Firstly, identity politics, the starting point is to eliminate any idea of universal values. Instead, you're looking at power. And the power is then developed by dividing people into groups, and the number of groups is never ending. There's always more groups, there's always more subdivisions. And then the groups are examined, and we define people as either victim or oppressor, because there are differences between groups, and the differences are defined only as due to prejudice and oppression. So victim groups are established and oppressor groups are established. And then something strange happened. If you're in an oppressor group, or even trying to defend the position of a group that's been designated the oppressor, you are painted as being completely beyond the pale. You're no platformed. You are the accursed thing, the thing that must be cast out. It becomes as though you're kind of subhuman. Now, this has been running in the Labour Party for some time. The Palestinian lobby has come in and seen this, and they have pointed to the very legitimate examples of prejudice against Palestinians in Israel and the conduct of the Israeli state. And they have therefore painted the Israeli state in the oppressor category. And the entire Labour movement then turned around and joined in this and painted the Israeli state and anyone who defends it and anyone who supports it as this kind of subhuman. So you have this atmosphere where there's a lot of people in Labour talking about people who support Israel in terms that paints them as subhuman. And it certainly has the feel of anti-Semitism. It lays themselves open to the charge of anti-Semitism. But out of this conversation has come people pointing out things like undue influence in British politics, a lot of things which are true. And the killer part of the identity politics, it's winner takes all. There can be no dialogue. So we're not able to have a dialogue about these things. We have to either pick, we're going after one side or the other in any given case. So it's either the Palestinians and the Palestinian lobby win, they take the victim position, and the Israelis are painted in a subhuman light, or the other happens. And there can be no middle ground because it's all about power and it's all about victory. There is no universal value and there's no discussion. And the only thing to do about it is to go back to universal values and start to discuss the real issues. And the Labour Party wouldn't do this. And because of that, they have really no answer. They can't pick a side, and so they're kind of frozen. That's where I see it. If you comment to that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting perspectives, and it's very interesting to analyze your position from a left perspective. And why? Because the initial left instinct is universal. It is in fact not that different from Christianity. It's all based on brotherhood. The reason that we liked Corbyn initially, some of us, and by the way, me included, is because Corbyn was an old-type lefty who spoke against identitarian politics. He said, for the many, not for the few. He tried to introduce a unifier that reminds us the idea of old left, in which it doesn't matter whether you are gay or transsexual or a woman or a Muslim or a Jew. We are all together against bankers, against the capitalists. What is so interesting is that at a certain stage, the left changed direction completely. Instead of uniting us, it started to divide us. We learned to speak, as I just mentioned 5 minutes ago, as a woman, as a Jew, as a transsexual. Instead of being one person, we learned to fight each other. And the shocking thing, that all this divisive project is funded in practice by a few bankers, and chief amongst them is probably George Soros through his Open Society Institute. Now, why it is interesting in the case of the Labour Party, because as much as Corbyn was an old-style lefty with this idea of universal value and a universal identifier, his prime supportive group in the Labour Party is Momentum, that are totally identitarians. So even Corbyn, even before he realized what was going on, he was practically hijacked by a very troubling politics that is totally foreign to its ideals. Now, just one more point that is very important for me about identitarianism and how cancerous and rotten it is. Many people do not like a clear aspect in Hitlerian philosophy. What is it? Racism. What was Hitler's racism? Hitler was a racist because he hated Jews for being Jews, because he hated allegedly Gypsy for being Gypsy, maybe black for being black. What is so troubling about identitarian politics is it the idea that we start to identify with our biology. The black are identifying with their biology. The Jews are identifying with their biology, with the blood of the mother. The gays are identifying with their biology. Instead of looking for that which unites us, we actually adopted the most embarrassing aspect in Aryan biologism. And this is exactly what the Labour Party is hijacked by, and it's a disaster. There is no way to resolve it. And as you mentioned, I just now get back to you, mentioning it, which is the core of the problem, makes you into the ultimate enemy because they cannot produce an answer.
Yeah, that's a fascinating and absolutely devastating critique of the whole thing. That really put it extremely well. I just like to park that one just for a little while. We'll come back to this issue in this area perhaps later on. If we could hand over just now to Alex Thompson. Alex wants to take this discussion in a slightly different direction to do with the response of what might be broadly called Christendom to the formation of Israel as a state and its development over the last 70 years. So, Alex.
Well, like you, David, and like Brian as well, I was brought up by committed Christians and have become a Christian in my own right. And what I'd like to say in just a couple of minutes is that the churchgoers of Britain, both Protestant and Roman Catholic, are way behind the curve of political awareness of the rest of Britain. And I think this is true in the United States as well, with its distinctives there, which are different from Britain and other English-speaking countries. You see the same thing, way behind the curve of other sectors of the population in understanding what the state of Israel is. Growing up in the 1980s as a small boy, I was still hearing, in those days it was from then older people who had witnessed the formation of the State of Israel in 1948, I was hearing in evangelical Protestant churches that the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 had been a sheer act of God, and that the plucky little Jews had seen off the Arabs against tremendous odds. Yet this was not being taught to us in the 1950s, as it would have been taught perhaps more appropriately to my parents as small children, but actually after the events of 1967, 1973, and even after the Oded Yinon Plan of 1980, which called for the Balkanization of the entire Middle East. In a sense, we had already got onto the third iteration by then in Israeli political life of the idea of what do we do with the Arabs, who are often, it's often forgotten, many of them are Christians within the territory of Israel and Palestine. And it was as if the Christians still thought in the West that Israel was in its first iteration. Now, that first iteration is when Israel was ruled by markedly irreligious, communistic kibbutzniks. Well, that's a very much a blunt description of the labor movement in Israel that was dominant from 47 onwards. From after the Six-Day War of 1967 onwards, Israel becomes an occupier contrary to international law of territory which no state recognizes that it has a right to hold, nor the United Nations. This event seems to pass the churches by, and as with it, the concomitant fact that Israel is now occupying a large number of Christian and Muslim Arabs. And so we've moved on from a secular vision of universal brotherhood to markedly religious Zionistic vision, but not, I would say, a biblical Zionist vision of here we are occupying land of foreigners whom we have to keep subdued. And then arguably from the late 1970s onwards, with the Likud party coming to the lead under Menachem Begin, and certainly in the era of Ariel Sharon and Bibi Netanyahu latterly being at the helm of Israel, we've moved on to a third iteration, which is how do we get rid of everyone between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River who is not a Jew? And I don't mean to accuse Israel as a state here of plotting genocide, but certainly mass expulsion seems to be agreed upon. Only this week we have seen Israeli film starlets on social media getting into spats with the Netanyahu government, which is now having to ally with extremely right-wing Jewish identitarian parties and possibly even cut deals with Arab Israeli parties representing the Muslim and Christian Arabs in the country and the Druze in order to avoid being beaten by the more left-wing powers in Israel. And these starlets have been saying on social media, do we not realize that Arabs are people too, even if they live in Israel? In fact, they're citizens. So this debate is actually something that I think that the churches have fallen well behind the curve in understanding. Just the other day, as I read through the Bible daily, and I was at Isaiah chapter 60, verse 18 the other day, and the message to Jerusalem given there is, violence shall no more be heard in thy land, wasting nor destruction within thy borders, but thou shalt call thy walls salvation and thy gates praise. And I think it would be as well for Christians of whatever shade to stop a moment and think, is this a true description of Jerusalem or the land of Israel in this day? And if not, we may as well have the boldness to ask ourselves the stark question, was the event of 1948, certainly in light of 67 as well, an act of God or not? We could go on from that and talk about the persecution of Christian pastors of Jewish ethnicity in Israel, such as we see often in Beersheba, with congregations being attacked with the connivance of the Israeli police by bunches of religious Jews of one particular persuasion, I must say. Not all of the religious Jews attack congregations. This is not spoken about, and yet Her Majesty's government is very keen to point out the outrage of attacks on Christian congregations in any other country of the world that isn't Israel. And I think on the final point on this, I would say there's a growing awareness, but sadly not in the churches yet, of the fact that of the rise of Israel as a state in 1948, even before there was occupation of Palestinian territories. There was, of course, expulsion of the Arabs already west of the river in the territory within which Israel first existed. And here we have, it won't be news to anyone here, I think, in the discussion, but perhaps to some of the viewers, we have the group of irregulars which later became the Likud party, now in government in Israel, when it was still in the form of being the Irgun and its splinter group, the Lehi or the Stern Gang, particularly Lehi, led by Begin, of course. There were plans out to assassinate all the post-war leaders of Britain and America: Bevin, Truman, possibly General Patton, possibly Churchill himself, and plans to mass poison London's water supply. It's not me making this up. This is reported in Haaretz, the leading Jerusalem newspaper, and many other Jewish sources. And then in Bournemouth in 1946, I believe it was, the Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin gave a speech at Bournemouth talking about the woeful agitation of New York Jewry to drive a wedge between Britain and America over quotas of Jews accepted to America being kept as low as possible to force them all into Palestine, where they would cause the conflagration, which 2 years later in 48 became the State of Israel. So even at the time of Israel coming into existence, which many churches teach in Britain and America today was a work of God, there was not only shall we say, violence afoot, but terrorism directed against the Jews of the Middle East in false flag operations, directed against the leaders of the West who had intervened, we are told now, to rescue the Jews of Europe, and even mass genocide and terrorism events being planned for London by the same men who later became the rulers of Israel. So Gilad, I'm very interested in your thoughts and how you have interacted with churches in Britain.
I really don't have enough information about that, but all the issues that you are raising are are pretty valid, very accurate, and very interesting. There was just one mistake. Begin was the commander of the Irgun, not of the Lehi. This is minor, but they were closely related. The Lehi broke out from the Irgun. It's not interesting. Forget about it. But one of the things, and this is my new project, my new writing project, that I have to complete, and deals with exactly those issues. One of the things that I'm working on at the moment is the transition between early Zionism, that was a movement that was primarily anti-Semitic. The early Zionists were pretty disgusted by the diaspora Jewish identity. They were motivated by the aspiration to bring to the world a new Jew who is productive, and this is why you mentioned the kibbutzim, those collective agriculture societies. The whole idea of the kibbutz is to bring along a Jew who is, in practical terms, an anti-Jew, a person who is working in the field, who is not afraid of labor, who is not seeking to end up as a broker in Wall Street, but seeking pleasure in bonding with the soil. What is amazing is that while the early generations of Israelis, and before Israelis, Hebrew Palestinians, Zionists, and so on, were totally anti-diaspora, after 67, Israel changes direction and it becomes the Jewish state. All, or the vast majority of Palestinian solidarity activists are telling us that the Judaism was hijacked by Zionism. What I'm showing now is that it is the other way around, that Zionism was hijacked by Judaism and Jewishness. And this is why Israel is deteriorate constantly, adopting more and more right-wing supremacist philosophies. And at the moment, I don't know if you know, at the moment, there is the Attorney General and the High Court in Israel has to decide whether the Arab parties can even run for the next parliament, for the Knesset, because the Knesset commission decided that they can't. They are not qualified to run in a Jewish state. So it's a big debate in Israel. Israel has become the Jewish state, voluntarily defined itself as the Jewish state, and by doing so, it consciously started to remove itself from those universal values that were pushed by labor Zionism. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not a defender of labor Zionism, and I will be the first one to admit that the biggest crime against the Palestinians was committed by labor Zionism, but I will introduce a very unusual idea now. One of the biggest anomalies in our understanding of Zionism and early Zionism is the fact that the 1948 expulsion of 75% of the Palestinians was committed practically by labor Zionists, by kibbutzniks, by people who actually wanted to remove themselves from inhuman conduct, immoral, and so on and so on. While working on this project, and I'm saying something now that I think that no one at the moment can agree with me, but I'm convinced that I'm right, or that this is a valid explanation. I understand now that what we saw in 48, the expulsion of so many Palestinians, was totally brutal, wasn't because those kibbutzniks hated the Palestinians and the Christians. And by the way, the Christians were treated the same. You know, the Muslims and Christian Palestinians. It is because they hated themselves. In order to remove themselves from this diaspora image, and we are talking 3 years after the Holocaust, of the Jew who is going like lamb to the slaughter, they say, no, we're taking responsibility for our life, and they threw out the Palestinians. Again, not because they hated the Palestinians, but because they hated the image of the diaspora Jew. They wanted to be different. Now, this is a very interesting element, because, as you know, I define myself as a self-hater, which is a bit inconsistent with the fact that I'm an ex-Jew. But self-hatred is a very interesting force within the Jewish culture. Once you are not afraid to deal with it, you start to understand Jewish behavior, Jewish culture from dialectic perspectives.
I think we find a microcosm of this in the Menuhin family, 3 generations of them, because
Absolutely.
in that post-war era, the 1940s, the inaugural class of, I forget the name right now, but the elite secular left-wing Zionist academy in or around Tel Aviv, one of the graduates of that class is Moshe Menuhin, born 1906, actually, so a little earlier than that. But anyway, the first class, and he certainly watches in horror, and he goes into print in 1965 in a book which originally was called The Present State of Judaism, which is now reprinted and available under the title Not by Might Nor by Power. And Moshe Menuhin has to write in the preface, even 2 years before the Six-Day War, and while the Labour secular Jews are still in power in Israel, has to warn in the preface, nobody should stymie the career of my genius son Yehudi Menuhin, the violinist, simply because I'm writing this. So even then there was a problem with the self-hatred which he expresses. And he's very much of the view that the prophetic task for Jews was to be diaspora in the nations, and that from the first and second exile of Jews in the late Old Testament period onwards, the returning to the land of Israel was almost a disobedience. Well, that's a very debatable issue theologically, which we can't get into. But then, of course, you get Yehudi, who keeps his mouth shut, and then finally that his son, Gerhard, writes a book, first in German and then in English translation, called Tell the Truth and Shame the Devil, going into more detail on what this complex of issues in Judaism has done to Europe, and particularly Germany.
Now, this is a very, very, I think that we cannot really, it's a huge topic, and it is a very interesting topic, and the most banal way to look at it is to admit that the Jews who contributed the most to humanity, and I'm talking here about, let's say, Jesus and Spinoza, and maybe Marx, maybe not, you know, it depends. If I'm not talking about Marxists, I'm not talking about Marx himself. And I would say even Otto Weininger, they were a rabid self-haters. So being a self-hater, when you're coming from a supremacist tribal culture, is actually being a universal humanist. And this is exactly what Jesus was. This is exactly what Spinoza was. If we want to take it one step further, it is very easy to see that Jews are very often very fearful of the self-haters. You can see what the Sanhedrin did to Jesus, how the rabbinical institutions treated Spinoza. The same happened to Marx by the hands of some East European rabbis, and so on and so on. Why are they so afraid of self-haters? Why is it that when I hate myself, other Jews are offended? I don't say that I hate Jews, I say I hate me. How is it possible that I hate me and other Jews are fearful by my self-hatred, by the fact that I hate myself? There are a few answers. One possible answer is that I bring to the surface something that they don't like about themselves. All right? The fear of the self-hatred is the fear that we will see some deep problems that are collective surfacing. Now, there are a few other answers, but I think that in the case of Menuhin, it's a very, very interesting perspectives. I read his book. I did learn a lot, kind of a lot of ideas that I was familiar with. But while some Jews will see him as a total enemy, I see a search for humanity, and I find a similar search in myself.
Just leading on from that, Gilad, one of the background of people who are afraid and afraid of what lies within as much as anything else can make huge difficulties when you're trying to reach out to people. One of the things that the UK column, and particularly led by Brian, has done is to reach out to people across community barriers and find a lot of common ground, find really surprising common ground. So if I could maybe hand over to Brian at this point, just to explore how we might reach out to Jews within our own communities.
I have to say that reading Gerhard Menuhin's book, Tell the Truth and Shame the Devil, I found that a really fascinating read for its subject matter, and also because it was so detailed and well referenced. And I'd encourage other people to read that book and see what they get out of it. But Gilad, you've explained how 2,000 years can assist people to have a common bond and direction. It gives them a particular flavour. We're clearly seeing something that's not nice at work, and it's clear to me anyway that when we look at Israel, we can see that there's controversy in Israel itself. There are people who don't agree with the Zionist political agenda. They don't agree with the government. Some of the divide is over religious grounds, because we've got Orthodox Jews who can be particularly anti-government. So there's shades of grey as well. But we can get a feeling that there's something at work, just as there is in this country. Now, I started off by saying we could sense some influence by Israel within the politics of this country, but I also believe that if we take a detached look at our own politicians, we can often feel that there are other forces at work causing trouble. Where does this lead me? It leads me to the fact that I think that just as we've got, whatever we call them, criminal types, we may use a different description and say sociopaths operating within our political system. We seem to have those defects operating within the Israeli political system. So we know the pond is shades of grey. How should we form, if we're offering a hand to say, at the end of the day, we're all of one. This is one of the points that you've made, that we've had a gender politics splitting people apart. Now we're saying, well, we may live in UK, you may live in Israel. How do we offer a hand and say, how can we actually work together to solve these malevolent political influences?
It is a beautiful question, and I hope that I can answer it. To start with, those, and quite a lot of Jews, see how wrong it is. I know them, I know many of them, but they are not self-identifying politically as Jews. Yeah? So you may have a neighbor, and he is of a Jewish origin, and he's like you. He's British, living here. He's not necessarily keeping the tradition. Maybe once a year he eats chicken soup, and this is the end of it. You know, he's concerned by exactly the same issues as yourself, and you don't have to reach to him because he's not different from you. Now, when it comes to people, and this is one of the things that I found out when I wrote The Wandering Jew, and I'm punished for writing it on a daily basis. I just learned to enjoy this punishment, so it's not very effective. One of the things that I found out is that when it comes to Jewish political identification, it doesn't matter if you are left or right, if you are Momentum or UKIP, if you are within that a self-identifying Jew, politically, you are primarily concerned with your tribal interests. And then it is very fortunate because you cannot reach to it, not reach him or her, because it's a sealed component. And in order to understand how sealed it is, I'll have to take you for a 2,000 year journey that will take me something like 45 seconds. Judaism, as we know it, was formed in Babylon. The conditions in Babylon were very similar to the conditions for Jews in Europe in the 19th century. Assimilation, prosperous life, Jews assimilated very easily, mixed marriages, and so on and so on. At that point in history, some Jews understand that if it goes like that, there won't be Jews within 1 or 2 generations. And this is where they form a religion where the Jews are segregated and they are always aspiring to return to their promised land, to Zion, to Jerusalem. Within this condition, they produce a culture that is differentiating the Jews from the people around them through kosher dietary, through strict in-marriages, and synagogues, minyan. Even when you go to a synagogue, you need at least another 9 members. So you cannot live alone in the forest and being a Jew. But being a Jew, you need to live in a community. If I'm coming to visit your town, I have to find a synagogue because I cannot pray on my own. I need a minyan. I need 10 people. They build all these instruments in order to isolate, to segregate the Jews. The Jews never feel right where they are. They always aspire to return to another country. Now we understand why there is a conflict. Listen, there are Italians living here, and after one generation, they become Brits. You know, my kids are living here, and they are now Brits. And they are Brits because I wasn't raised as a Jew, I was raised as an Israeli. All right, now, at a certain stage in time, the Jews decide to return to Zion. This is the Zionist movement. This is what Israel is now. When they come to Israel, they are very happy for a few weeks, but then the Jewishness doesn't mean anything anymore because there is no other people to segregate from. There is no other people to be in conflict, and the entire religion is based on an exilic identity. And this is where they invent the Palestinians as the goyim du jour. This is when the Palestinians are becoming others. Now, the existence of Israel can only be realized once they return to a ghetto. And this is why, despite the fact that Israel was there to develop a new Jewish identity of people who live in an open land, see the sky, and you look 70 years later and they are surrounded by humongous walls, the biggest ghetto walls ever, because they brought the diaspora to Israel. Israel is not a state, it's a huge successful ghetto.
This brings us to one of the next topics that Alex wanted to raise, which is examples of anti-Semitism within Jewry. So, Alex.
Yes, well, I think that there's both directions in which we can speak of anti-Semitism within Jewry. Gilad, David, and Brian have been painting a picture here of effectively two wings within Jewry or Judaism. And of course, there are many exceptions and complications, but we have generally been identifying a block of secular Zionists, largely by definition living in Israel rather than in the diaspora, but some of them do live in such places as New York and London. And on the other hand, religious Zionists, whose vision for what it is to be Jewish is more to keep the mitzvot of Hashem, the commandments of God. And we are more familiar, I think, with one direction of this anti-Semitism claim within Jewry, and that is the direction in which the secular Zionists, who gained the absolute ascendancy in Israel from 1948 and who are now losing it out because of the demographic attrition in favor of the Haredim and Hasidim, the religious Jews, they often oppose and really harass the religious Jews, the Haredim and the Hasidim, those who, for example, wear the traditional Jewish clothing that came out of the European ghettos, who speak Yiddish, who do not own allegiance to Israel, who do not want to be called Israeli citizens, some of them living in parts of Jerusalem and not even in the territory of official Israel. We're familiar with this because groups of anti-Zionist religious Jews, such as Neturei Karta, will stand outside Israeli embassies in the West with Palestinian lapel pins on and call for themselves to be Palestinian citizens, and will say that Mashiach has not come, it's not in line with the commandments of God to form a state of Israel. That we are perhaps familiar with, but something more recently, which I became aware of through the writing of a New York rabbi writing in the 1970s called Marvin Untelman in his two-volume book, To Eliminate the Opiate, is that this has also happened in the other direction. And what Gilad already said earlier helps me to understand how this self-hatred could manifest from that wing of Judaism back to the other wing. What I'm talking about here is that there were a number of cases of members of Rabbi Antelman's congregation and other related synagogues being beaten up on the streets of New York in the 1970s. And what he passed back to Cherut, which is the predecessor of the Likud party, he passed back to their intelligence center in Israel, is that actually members of other Jewish religious persuasions, the conservative and the reform persuasions, were actually involved in agitation against the religious Jews, which was getting physical on the streets of New York. Now, Antelman is largely writing about the Illuminati and about the use of secret societies, but for once, this isn't in the direction we'd expect. It is a religious, should we say, a classical religious Zionist who believes in the return of the Jewish people to Israel, saying this is actually coming from more liberal wings of Judaism itself. And before I hand back to Gilad, I would also like to read out something relevant to this, which is the preparedness. We're going back to the more familiar direction of travel within this internal Jewish anti-Semitism now, the direction in which unreligious secular Zionists persecute religious Jews. Two examples of this from the period just before the Holocaust. One is that Lord Victor Rothschild, of course, who was basically running British intelligence during the war and telling Churchill what to do in many ways, wrote to a friend in a letter which is preserved that one thing is certain: if we have a land of Israel after the war, there will be no room in it for what he calls poor schnorrers, a Yiddish word meaning those who wear facial hair, i.e. religious Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews, whom his lot despised. And in fact, a military historian originally from Greenock in Scotland called John Costello was on the point of writing an entire book about Rothschild's preparedness to see the poor schnorrers liquidated in the Holocaust, when in 1995 he suspiciously died in mid-Atlantic on a flight, and the book he didn't complete would have been called The Feast of Scorpions. And the other example I have regarding this comes from a relative of the novelist Graham Greene, and also a relative of Hugh Greene, the BBC director of 1960s. This was Ben Greene, and in a book of essays about the British Constitution, called The British Constitution and the Corruption of Parliament, we discover in the preface that Mr. Greene was dispatched by the Quakers to the Netherlands and Germany on the eve of the Second World War to see whether he could help the penniless Jews in Germany, those without international collections, to escape before the inevitable happened. And I'll read one paragraph of that. The stumbling block, says this introduction, so it's not Ben Green's own words, it's written by a relative of his. The stumbling block, to Ben's enormous surprise, turned out to be the Jews themselves. They would not agree, i.e. to a rescue proposal, because it meant foreign currency would be made available to the Germans. This was international finance with a vengeance. We have seen the same kind of thing in recent years in connection with South Africa, but the anti-apartheid fanatics are not usually black themselves, but rather purist whites. In this case, Ben Green could not persuade Rothschild to soften his stance. It was not that he did not believe the hardship stories that Ben Green told him. He must have believed them, for he phoned them through to Reuters in Ben's presence, without checking them in any way. But then it was the same reply: no help could cross German frontiers. That was perhaps quite a rambling section by me, but I think that the unifying thoughts in it are maybe apparent nevertheless. The preparedness of members of both of these blocks of Zionism, the secular and the religious, to see the other party beaten up and in many cases even massacred for the sake of the triumph of their own vision of Zionism.
I'd like to address initial point that we were discussing here, that you were discussing, as it was raised by David, the issue with anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism in the left. And I want to offer you a very simple principle that will help you to understand what is going on in Israel, in Israeli politics, in Britain, and especially in the British Labour. In the Jewish world, now I will say, Brian, to make you happy, in the Jewish world, we have, a concept that is called kick to the left. No, it's not we. They have a concept that is called kick to the left. Within the concept of kick to the left, every time you are pushed by a hardliner on your right, you kick to the left, and you are rehabilitating your position in the tribe. So if Avigdor Lieberman, let's say, I assume that some of us know what I'm talking about, is a hardliner, Israeli ultra-nationalist, and is critical of Benjamin Netanyahu, in order to buy credibility, he kicks to the left. He is harsh on the Labour Party, for instance. When it comes to the Labour Party, they are very harsh on Meretz, which is kind of a left body. And this goes to the diaspora jury. When it comes to the diaspora jury, people who are kind of centralist are accused of being self-haters or anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic. The way they want credibility, they pick on someone who is slightly more radical than themselves. I won't mention the name, but when the Jewish leftist ears started to harass me around 2004, 2005, they wrote to me, Gilad, it is very simple. All you have to do is to denounce A, B, C, and we will take you back. But I told them, listen, I really don't want it. I don't want you to take me back because I don't want to be a Jew. It's fine, you know. I don't follow. I'm not kicking to the left, and I'm not playing this game. Now, when we look at what is happening now in the Labour Party, and this is a colossal mistake made by Corbyn, who should have known by now what is going on. They are playing all the time the kicking to the left. So Corbyn supporters are accused of being anti-Semitic. They find a scapegoat and they kick them out of the party. And when these scapegoats are kicked out of the party, they do the same thing in order to buy credibility and hoping to one day being accepted. They find other people whom they blame of being anti-Semitic. The reason that momentum, which is unfortunately operating in an Asbara board at the moment, momentum, Judas, the reason that they kick me actually at the is because they want to buy credibility within the labor institutes. What we learned from it, that the Labour Party in its current form actually adopted the Jewish diaspora narrative. This is not how left body should behave. This is exactly a Stockholm syndrome, typical of an occupied POW.
We're reaching the end of our chat, unfortunately, at the moment, but I'd like to finish off with two things. Firstly, I want to lay out a thumbnail of a model of what the political left and right is that I've been working on just for a short while, and perhaps get Gilad to comment on it. Because strange though the left is, the right's even harder to pin down. What is it really? And then if Gilad, after that, if you could finish up with a little explanation of what you've been facing in very recent days with the current momentum and Judas attack on your career and your ability to earn a living, and just what you have seen developing there, to finish off with something that's very much of the moment. So, firstly, this model moment of left and right, it came from I spotted an examination of what the word diabolos means from when you get diabolic and references to Satan, and the dia means to separate. And the second part, which is what Balin it comes from, means to throw. So we're talking about a concept that throws apart. Now, I thought that was very interesting, that it's diabolical to drive wedges and to throw people apart. But looking at the early part of the Bible and the story of Eden, the lie that was told by the serpent was that you will be as gods. You know, stick with me, you will be as gods. And the thing that is described in the Bible that most highlights what gods are is unity. The text that Jews have on the doorposts, usually translated "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The Lord is our God, the Lord is one." I would say that that's not a very good translation. "Hear, O Israel, our God's plural, our Lord is united." But the concept of being united and being together as something that makes you as God is kind of right in at the sort of start of Genesis. And it struck me that what the left does, the left believes the lie, right? The diabolical comes and it says, through our unity, we will be great and we will bring the utopia that is to come. And the left buy that. And they go down a route that generates huge division because it's a lie, because it's deception. The right doesn't buy it. The right sees these divisions as being natural or being unavoidable and tries to deal with it, sometimes even to promote the divisions, but does it knowingly. So it struck me that the left is like the Eve, the female character in Eden, right? Eve was fooled. Eve bought the lie. And the right is like Adam, because Adam came along and said, well, it's a done deal. I've got to deal with the world as it is. I'll eat of the forbidden fruit as well, because well, otherwise, things get very complicated with the marriage. And so he went in knowing. So the left are prone to utopianism and being fooled. The right are prone to say, well, let's be logical. Let's take the world as it is. Let's identify what we're dealing with and just work around. It means that the left is more deadly because people who think they're doing evil for the sake of good will go further. It means that the right tend to have a bit more of a brake on them because they have to justify on some sort of level that this is necessary, and eventually that lie can't be sustained. But they both come from the same place. So that's the start of the model. So if you could comment on that, and then maybe just finish up with some of your recent adventures in earning a living in Britain.
To start with, the point that you were raising is very similar to the idea that I'm developing, that I developed in Being in Time. This is where I started my recent book, and to give another perspective of it, because the left is telling us what the world ought to be. We're supposed to live in justice, inequality, and so on and so on. The left is utopian, and the left message is shaped as a dream. The right is shaped as insomnia, because it's all the time in a state of being alerted to the fact that you may have a dream, but reality is slightly different. Because the left is shaped like a dream, it has this inclination to fall into a state of sleep. And this is why those within the left who wake up and say, oh, things are not working, are always perceived as the enemy, because this is how you react to somebody that comes and tries to wake you up at 3 o'clock in the morning. So it's not that something is wrong in the left in terms of searching for equality and living together and working toward a better future. There is something that is shaped in the construction, in the metaphysical construction of the left argument, that brings a lot of problem into display. Okay. Now, you asked about my situation at the moment. Yes, for many years, since 2005, I've been subject to relentless attempt to destroy me. And why to destroy me? Because I'm exactly that guy who says the thing that shouldn't be said. I try to make sure people within the Palestinian solidarity movement understand that the terminology is completely misleading, and is set to mislead them, never to progress on Palestine. I've done the same thing to the left, to the Labour Party. At the moment, for instance, I'm subject to a lot of harassment because I pointed out that Corbyn's closest allies within the Labour Party are the JVL, which is a group that wouldn't accept Gentiles into its and it is in practice a racially exclusive group. I ask how Corbyn can be an anti-racist if his biggest allies in the party are a Jews on group. He himself cannot become a member of JVL because he is not racially qualified. Now, all those years, they tried to claim that I'm an anti-Semite. They couldn't progress. They tried to claim that I'm a Holocaust denier. They couldn't progress because I really don't deny. I'm not qualified to deny any historical narrative. As a philosopher, I argue that the past must be discussed freely without any history laws. So they tried to burn my books. It didn't work. They tried to stop me talking. It didn't work, and I'm quite popular. There are a lot of people who are interested in what I have to say. And I find myself from time to time, not enough to retire yet. And what they're doing in the last 4 or 5 months, or maybe the last year, is quite astonishing, but it is really counter-effective. They try. I'm also a musician. I'm quite a popular jazz artist, and I'm playing all over the world, and I'm playing with a very important band, and so on and so on. They try to mount pressure on my music career, and this is really counter-effective because I'm playing in all those clubs for decades. My band is half Jewish, so I cannot be an anti-Semite if I'm playing with people who happen to be Jewish. And all the club owners and the committees that run clubs know that I never really have done anything abusive. They know me as a very nice guy, very generous guy. And what the labor that is now running the campaign managed to achieve, they actually proved to us that if Germany was famous for burning books, for banning jazz artists, the Labour Party, with momentum at the helm, has managed to fall into exactly the same trap. They repeat in 2019 exactly the same mistakes that Hitler committed in 1933. And a lot of people tell me, sue them, sue them, sue them, and I'm not going to sue them, because if I sue them, I cannot bring to the public eye their conduct. If I would sue Owen Jones for calling me a Holocaust denier, I myself would be able to tell people, listen, look how this guy behaves. I prefer to do that. I don't trust the judicial system in this country at the moment. And instead of that, I let the British people judge for themselves. I prefer 10,000 people looking my video and make their mind than an untrustworthy judge in the High Court.
That's very interesting. We, on completely different areas, have come to the conclusion that trusting the British people and not trusting the judicial system is a very smart move. And I think we'll have to close it there. It's been fascinating, Gilad. I want to thank Alex. I want to thank Brian for their questions and their thoughtful ideas and their input today. And most of all, thank Gilad Atzmon. It's been a pleasure, as always, to listen to you. I hope we can do this again soon. And I hope to hear you play again soon, because it is very magnificent.
It's a lot of fun to listen to you guys, and you are really thinking people. And this is very refreshing to meet people like you, because not many are left, and those who can do it are afraid to do it. You are very brave. I love you. Thank you so much.